Stories have shapes. Few people talk about this, but as a professional screenwriter, I think about the shape of my story all the time, especially at the beginning when I'm crafting it. And I think it's important too for audiences to recognize the shape of a story if they really want to peel back the layers of that story that's being told to them. This gives you a deeper appreciation for the craft of storytelling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sure many of you think you know what a story shape is. You might be thinking about narrative arcs, or the hero's journey, or the three-act structure. But what I'm talking about is something different. I'm talking about the shape of the story, not the rise in tension or the change that the protagonist goes through. I'm not talking about a cyclical metaphor of returning home. I'm literally talking about how the story is told. How the writer molds the clay. You see, stories have shape, just like a statue has shape. Now I've got you curious. You're asking, what does that even mean? Well, that's what I want this lecture to be about. We're going to talk about the general shapes of stories, the common ones, and we're going to discuss why that's important and specifically how it relates to both theme and tension. And then we'll look at some of the more unusual shapes that filmmakers have used. And we'll try to figure out why they use these shapes. Because you see, that's the most important question. Why? Let me show you what I mean. A story's shape is determined by the rhythm of that story. Rhythm is what gives the story its shape in the first place. So when we talk about story shape, what we're really looking at is the rhythm of how the story is being told. For instance, we're all familiar with the old adage describing a romance. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, and to misquote Kurt Vonnegut, it doesn't really have to be a boy, it doesn't have to be a girl. That's just an easy way to remember the idea. So romance, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That's not a shape, that's the story, or the plot rather. And the romance genre has seen this plot many, many times. Many times. And over the years, storytellers have figured out a pretty good rhythm for telling these stories. It kind of goes like this. First you have a scene with the boy, and he's alone, or he's unhappy, or whatever. And then you have a scene with the girl, and she's also alone, or unhappy, or whatever. And then the boy, and then the girl, and then the boy, and then the girl. And now we've got a pattern going, right? And then they meet, and then they're together, and they're no longer alone or unhappy or whatever. And they're together, and they're happy, and they're together some more, and they're still happy until they're not. And then they break up. And then the story explores what happens as they grow apart. The rhythm changes again. So we have a scene with the boy and he's alone, and then a scene with the girl and she's also alone, and then the boy and then the girl and then the boy and then the girl, and then they're growing further apart and further apart. And as you can imagine, you can see the story now, right? Perhaps you can start to see a pattern or a shape. It's kind of looking like the letter X. The boy-girl apart, the boy-girl apart, the boy-girl apart, getting closer and closer together. And then they meet. And then they're together. That's the middle of the X, while they're together, and then they break apart. And then the boy and girl apart, and the boy and girl apart, and the boy and girl apart, getting further and further away, right? That's the X. But then, of course, they start to drift back together again. Boy, then girl, boy, then girl, boy, then girl, getting closer and closer and closer, and then boom, they're back together again, and they're happy again. And this pattern can repeat itself multiple times, or maybe just once. And the events can take place over days, over weeks, or even over years. All of that is left to the imagination. What's important to recognize is the pattern, the shape, because this shape does two things. First, it allows us to tell the story from two different points of view, which is important because we've all been on both sides of that equation. Liking someone and wanting to be liked by someone. Asking for a date or being asked out on a date. And we can empathize with each character, with each point of view, whether it's being lonely or finding Mr. Right, or being on the verge of a breakup. And if you didn't have two points of view, if you didn't have this shape to your romance, well, it really wouldn't be a romance, would it? Now, it might be a love story, a smaller part of a bigger genre story, for instance. I mean, you can tell one side of a love story with, for instance, a soldier at war, and we only see one side of the story, maybe hers, maybe his. But that's a war movie with a love story thrown in. But a romance, a genre romance, it depends on the story being told from both points of view. Classic and recent romance movies use this story shape. Think about it. Annie Hall, When Harry Met Sally, Moonlight, Carol, and Casablanca. Even the animated romance between robots, WALL-E, uses this shape for the story. So that's the first reason, to develop two points of view, which also strengthens the theme and the message of the romance. Now, we'll talk more about theme in another lecture, but suffice it to say, by recognizing the rhythm of the story, you can see how its shape reinforces a very broad theme. A love story, thematically, is about two equally rounded characters falling in love with each other. So it makes sense to have a story that is equally rounded in representing the lives of both people falling in love. The second reason? Tension. As we've discussed before, tension is the thing that keeps the audience wanting to know what's going to happen next. It's not conflict, although conflict can create tension. It's tension. It's what's going to happen next. And by continuously cutting back and forth between these two points of view, you create a sense of tension. The boy is heartbroken. He can't decide whether to go to the dance alone or to go at all. He picks up the tuxedo and cut to the girl. She puts her dress away. She throws her Valentine into the trash. She erases his number from her phone. And then a knock at the door. Cut to an empty living room. Someone's knocking on the door. The girl slowly comes down the stairs. What's going to happen next? Tension. Point of view and tension. Now we're completely engaged simply by cutting back and forth between the two characters who are falling into and out of love in our story. So that's romance. And as a screenwriter, as a filmmaker, if I'm making a romance movie or I'm writing a script, I'm thinking through my creative decisions on the front end. It's sort of like a code, right? I'm taking a story, a big amorphous idea full of characters and actions and reactions and repercussions, and I'm trying to figure out how to deliver that idea as best I can. And I know the shape that the story should probably take. Well, if I know that, then I can start thinking about the story as a dichotomy of scenes. Boy and then girl, boy and then girl, and then boy and girl together. It gives me a pattern, a rhythm that I can use to deliver my story. Because I only have a few hours to tell you a story that may span decades, involving dozens of characters, each with their own complexities. And that rhythm, in a way, becomes sort of a code, little dots and dashes maybe, that I can use to tell you a story. But equally as important is that you, as the audience, you have to receive that information. You have to receive that coded idea, those dashes and those dots, and then unscramble it to figure out what it all means. And to do that, you have to know the rhythm. You have to know the basics of the code that I'm going to send. If you think I'm going to send you a message using Morse code, and instead I use semaphores, we may have a problem. You may be expecting a romance, but get sports. It sounds like Monday night all across America. So, what do some of the other story shapes in some of the other genres look like? Well, some have distinct story shapes, and others don't. Through the years, film genres like crime and sports, horror and war have each developed simple story shapes that most audience members expect. Tell me if you recognize these shapes. The first is shaped like the letter Y. Sports film. On one side of the Y is the underdog. On the other side, the champs. And the story is the back and forth between the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the underdogs and the champs. And they keep getting closer and closer until they meet at the tournament. And the rest of the story is their battle to win the cup, the trophy, the scholarship, or whatever they're fighting for. Sound familiar? Think Tin Cup, Slapshot, Rocky, Hoosiers, Caddyshack, just to name a few. Even the poker movie Rounders, because it doesn't have to be a movie about sports to use the sports genre shape. In fact, you can find the exact same shape in another genre, crime movies. Except instead of underdog and champ, you have cops and robbers, the law and the criminal. A typical crime story might take this shape. You see the crime, and then you see the investigation, and then the criminal trying to get away, and then the crime fighter chasing him down, back and forth as the cop or the detective or the lawyer gets closer and closer to the bank robber or the serial killer or the kidnapper until the final confrontation at the end. Silence of the Lambs, anyone? Seven, Bonnie and Clyde, Fargo, Catch Me If You Can, etc. As a comparison though, just to throw it out there, Martin Scorsese movies don't use this structure at all. He mostly tells his gangster stories from just one side, the gangsters. And he creates tension with the characters themselves through internal conflict and through our interest in the characters' lives and what's going to happen next with them personally. Now, Scorsese does this intentionally. By illuminating only one half of the equation, he focuses our attention on the people, not on the crime. And that's his point. Scorsese isn't trying to teach us that crime doesn't pay. Instead, he's trying to engage us more broadly in a culture, and he does a pretty darn good job of it.